Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are just a few minutes before the hour, but I'm going to get us started because I have just a few small housekeeping announcements before we get started. I hope everyone is a little bit more awake than our 9 o'clock session. For those of you who weren't in here for our 9 o'clock, I'm Catherine. I'm the room facilitator, and I'll be keeping us on track and managing some Q&A. The keynotes are going to start at 2 o'clock today. We have afternoon keynotes for MYs this year. And that we will also have an expo floor open. It's from 11 a.m. to 6:30. A great time to check that out is during our 45-minute break, which we're going to have after this session. If you did not get scanned for this session, please remember to do so. That's how you get the survey for the event. It'll show up in your app after, like 15 minutes or so after the session. So that's another plug. Download that app. I feel like you've probably heard that 5 times already just this morning. And then finally, for something a little bit more fun, we are going to have our welcome reception tonight at that expo floor from 5 to 6:30. There'll be some refreshments, food, and a lot of great networking opportunities. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for this session, which is why we are all here. Pleased to introduce Bob Martin from MITRE. He's going to review MITRE's System of Trust Framework and Community. So Bob, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Okay, I can tell you, I'm glad I was down there looking out because right now I can't see you at all. But thank you for coming. Hopefully this will answer some questions. He was offering me sunglasses here. How many have heard something about MITRE's System of Trust? Okay, good. Have an opportunity to give you all some information. I'm sure you've all heard about supply chains. So supply chains really, you have raw materials, either harvested or produced. You have some kind of intermediate goods. You go through some major production, manufacturing, combination activity. Then you go through some kind of distribution. You get it out to the end user, and often you'll have some kind of a disposal activity. Well, the reason it's hard is it's global. It's all over the world. It's so cheap to move raw goods, intermediate goods, or finished goods from anywhere to anywhere that we do. And that's where the risks come in that a lot of them are due to people you don't know. They're not being produced down the road where you can get familiar with them and comfortable with them. So often this is talked about as third-party risk management. And if you're practicing that, I offer, are you getting into all the details of what that can mean in today's world? The last session actually talked a little bit about how that is changing the relationship between a supplier and their customers. So I would offer that you're probably not thinking about attackers and counterfeits. You're probably not thinking about hazards and disasters of all kinds, and not even the human ones. Why should you be an expert in all these areas? So what MITRE System of Trust is trying to do is bring all that together into one big corpus of, what are the potential risks from your supply chain so that you can actually pick from that, not have to imagine it, not look at a blank sheet of paper, not borrow it from your neighbor, but actually have a place to start. Now, that's a big part of this is you need to get a subset. You could never manage all the possible risks. So what are the ones that make sense for your business, for your industry, the decision you're making, the role that is in your organization, the time frame you have available? All those things can let you winnow it down to what we call a profile. So you then use that profile for that kind of transaction. So what do we cover in System of Trust? Well, there's 3 kind of coordinates. There's the supplier, there's the item of supply, and then the service offerings. And we actually have 14 top-level risks in those areas. So some examples of some supplier risks could be something to do with their financial stability, either short-term, long-term, volatility combined with the market, you know, a lot of different offerings there. Could be their security practices, whether it's their physical security, their cyber security, their personnel security, any of those areas. Then another one could be, you know, how are they organized? Are they susceptible to geographic risks, geopolitical risks, those kinds of things? Then there's the actual ethical risks. Are they, you know, tied up in kinds of, you know, nasty lawsuits? They're always being brought up in charges. They're tied with foreign governments. You know, it depends on you which one of those are the right ones for you, but we want to offer them for you to pick from. And then there's your external influences. What's their ownership structure? What are their teaming agreements? Things that could impact the way they behave day to day. So those are just examples of this one area. This goes down much deeper. But at that 3 level, this kind of is the overview. And what I just showed you were those. But it goes down 7 or 8 levels deep, because you want to get down to what you are going to measure. So categories are great for getting your thinking organized, but you really want to be able to get down to a risk, and then you say, well, what data do I need to determine if that risk is actually present or not, or how big, and where do I get that data, and then how do I interpret what I'm going to find? That's all things that we're going to be putting into system of trust, because that vocabulary is just one part. There's a data model behind it, so all the different pieces and how they tie together are described and defined. And we actually have a tool that's a cloud-native application. It's a prototype, but it's what we're using for content management. And anyone here can get an account and look at it and run around and get to know it. We've been doing piloting, and so one of the things we can do then is you pick that profile and you export it into a spreadsheet, and then you can evaluate it. Think about it, really at that point, it's almost a questionnaire. Now you want to automate some of those questions, but it's basically a structured, here are the risks I care about, now let's go answer them. If you can't get data on it, it's still a risk, it's still an unknown. And so you need to have that completeness. So we've been doing piloting, and the one thing I can tell you we are going to do is how do you show the results? And we're not going to be showing it as a summed up number. Think about those 14 top level categories. Any risk in one particular one could overshadow all kinds of great things. You think about security clearance. If you answer to one of those 18 pages of questions, yes, I'm a known convicted felon. Guess what? It doesn't matter what you answer to any of the others. And there's those kinds of showstoppers in almost any kind of organization. So you need to make sure that you can get those up to the board, to the officers. And so we think those 14 top level may be the, you know, control panel briefing pieces. So, kind of sum it up, there's this logical model, data model. We're building system of trust, which is a catalog of risks that you may encounter from supplier, supply, or services. And services, by the way, are manufacturing as a service, trucking as a service, not just the guy who comes and installs something. And so you come into this with a particular business point of view. With that point of view, with that context, you get a profile, a subset of system of trust content, and then you use it to evaluate. If you have a different context, you have a different subset. And the subset, by the way, could be the exact same questions, but different weights. Because for this one, foreign ownership is a bigger concern than for this other. And so then you end up with a different basis of evaluation. And the key here is, if you're looking at multiple people that you could be working with, you use that same profile against each of them, or you have an ongoing relationship and you do it periodically. Now it depends on how often the data underneath it changes. You know, some corporate filings and other data are quarterly or year, so some of these aren't going to change very often. But other pieces may change weekly, maybe all the time. So you can also do continuous monitoring by having that same profile. So let me, I talked about the profiles. We actually, on this website, and it's sot.mitre.org, there's a place where we actually talk about an example profile. It's basically organizations that are highly sensitive to foreign influence. I don't know anyone in the Beltway that would have that characteristic. But this is basically going through and explaining that subset and how we go about it. We have about a dozen of them already defined. I think we'll have many more. So how many here are familiar with OSD's SCRIM taxonomy? So they went and they created a taxonomy of the areas that in supply chain that they want to focus on. And so basically it has 12 top level categories and then expands out to 124, next level. Well, compared to system of trust, this is where jetliners fly, while system of trust comes down to the corner down the street, down where you actually can make measurement. So we are actually working to map these. So if you look at one, they have financial stability, liquidity. So if you come into system of trust, that's under the finance, health, and then you come down, we actually have one that says liquidity. It's really close to what they're talking about. And then we have some particular measures that you can make. If you're familiar with this area, quick ratio is a matter of what's your financial assets versus your liabilities. Do you have more money than you have liabilities? Do you have the same or do you have less? That's the three buckets. So going back to that example I had you of the suppliers, wanted to dig into this a little bit more. So I mentioned that you get down to measurable risks and then where the data is. So that's called a risk factor. And so all the stuff above it, all the cataloging, categorizing, those are risk categories. Here you can see at the top we had risk category 76, and then it goes through two more risk categories before it gets to an RF. That's a measurable risk. And so what do we have there? We have a definition, we'll have where can you go get that data, and then we'll have how do you interpret the data you find. And that's the same pattern we're looking for all of these so that we can have a discussion and hopefully agreement on how to interpret, how to evaluate these different risk areas. Now, some risk factors may have many dimensions of risks that are measurable, and so there could be, a dozen risk measures, and you can tailor which of those you're going to use too. So this is how I'm going to assess this type of risk. So one of the pilots we did, company we looked at, they had 4 issues in this area. So I'm about to go use that same company to show you a couple of the others. So this was in financial risk. Another example would be in their, how are they organized? And we're coming down to, mergers and acquisition. They're always buying and selling units. Well, too much of that can be a risk. So here's an example of a definition. Where do you find the data? What's the rubric? And here they had 8, which is only moderate. I personally would have thought that was high, but that's what the financial people in the world have decided. So then another area would be this one where basically ethics. Here we can see we come through a couple RCs, finally get to a measurable risk, and here it's the number of lawsuits against the company or their principals. So you can see this kind of get data, figure out, does that say the risk is present or not, and then go from there. Last one is about external influence, and here, they're owned by US. Now, that particular question is going to change because we're trying to make this international. So, we want to make that owned by whatever, country they're comfortable saying that that's the low risk, rather than be it US-centric. But of course, we're here. So what you do with all that data is you can plot it like this. And so here you can see 6 of the 7 risk areas for a supplier. And the little bubbles are all risk factors. Underneath there's a hierarchy that I kind of dissolved to show you this. But these are all things you can get online. So there are things that you could do kind of as a due diligence quick check that you could do of companies that would only take, well, if we get it all automated the way we hope, it would take seconds to do. And that could be an interesting dashboard for new ones or watching the market or anything like that. So the bottom line of this is we have this catalog of potential risks. We have a bunch of risk measures that either are showing the risk is being managed, they're good things or green, or they're indicators that could be good or bad, so they're indeterminate until you measure it. That's kind of the yellow. And then there's other things where, oh yeah, if you find this, it's bad. It's a red. And the idea here is, well, where do I get the data? So a lot of people want to say, oh, I get it online because I want it done fast. Well, the truth is you're going to have risks that you can't find the data online. So you may be able to find it by compliance to standards. If they truly are following certain standards, that tells you practices that they're following, and that may show you they're mitigating risks. So we're doing some exercise with a lot of people in industry to map those standards to what risks in system of trust they're coupled with. And so if you go say, yeah, they follow these standards, when you go look at the questions, you'll see that means they follow these standards. And then you can interpret, what that means on the risk. Does it take it away? Does it modify it? It's up to you, but we're just trying to map it. But the other things you can do, it's what we do today. We get data about the product, we test it, or we understand what's going on in the factory, we go inspect it. So think about system of trust is all the risks you need to manage wherever you're going to get the data. And then obviously you want to get as much of the data as efficiently as possible. So that's where automation, where a lot of the illumination vendors may be able to offer things. There's government sites. But that's how we're trying to get this, is you own the risk. Well, what risks are you trying to manage? And then where are you going to get the data and how are you going to interpret it? And do that in a repeatable way. So basically, the way we're mapping this this is actually our tool, the Risk Model Manager. What you're seeing is the list of sources, and so we map them to the individual questions. And so when you see an evaluation version of this, you'll see down here, well, how am I going to answer this question? Well, one option would be go do general research. You just have an analyst who goes, finds the answer, documents what they found, and that's how you answer it. Or maybe it's directing you to go to Bloomberg, to this part of their reports, and grab it there if you have an account. Or we're going to try to automate some of those where it may be available in some government site. So that's kind of the structure of this. But the goal is to show a way of repeatably assessing the same set of standards, whatever points of the compass you end up using, so that you can look at vendors, suppliers, supplies, the service offering, or some combination. So we have a community. If you go to the website, you'll see a list of companies that are basically helping us and perfect this and evolve this. They're piloting it. You'll find some of them are very, very knowledgeable about software supply chains. You'll find some of them are very understanding and really deep into microelectronics. So they have insights into risks from there. Others are devices, and devices can be medical devices, they can be vehicles. So we have a bunch of different people that are involved in supply chains of devices. We have some that offer services in this area, that illumination type vendors. And so they're offering, they have data. They want to make sure the risk that data can answer is in system of trust somewhere. And then the last ones are the standards groups. So we have a bunch of companies there, organizations, and we want more. So one of the things we did with this community is I sent them a Christmas present last year, a first draft. And it basically was about 78 pages of the content and asked them for feedback. And we've been getting a lot of good feedback. We now are going to have over 150 pages of material. But remember, you make a profile. You don't need to do all of that. But it's a great place for you to start from. And so we've actually just had our second community meeting last week. We're basically coming together quarterly, face-to-face, and it's a hybrid because some of the organizations are global. But basically, we're working with them to improve this, to make sure the kind of data sources they know, the kind of rubrics they understand, the kind of ways of weighing the different aspects of supply chain security are all covered. So I mentioned the mapping of standards. So here's one example, TIA, Telecommunications Industry Association. They have a supply chain security standard. And what we're doing is looking at each of the clauses and figuring out, does that clause speak to a risk that's in system of trust? And we have an update in our online tool, the Risk Model Manager, that's going to let us capture these as, here's the document, here's its sub-clauses, here's the sub-sub-clauses, and then be able to map all that. And another thing we're going to do with this is, if we get all these standards mapped to system of trust, we can map any standard to any standard too. So if you need to be shown compliant to something, we think there's a there in this side effect, but of interest. Unfortunately, there's a lot of standards that speak to different aspects of supply chain. So we're looking for people to be able to get an account on RMM, capture a standard they know and care about, and then offer that back to MITRE so that we can then look at it and bring it in. I don't have the staff, the wherewithal for all of that. Couple things, just because I don't want you to leave here thinking that system of trust is something more than what I'm hopefully told you. It's not some database with all kinds of risk data in it. It's a framework. So it is a structured way of looking at the issues. You still need to go find the answer. We're going to offer ways, suggestions on way you can do it. We'll have some automation for some of it, but we're not keeping that data anywhere. You would just use that mechanism to get the data when you want to do the evaluation. It's not a competitor with any risk management process, either government, dictated ones. It's a companion, because all of these risk management approaches tell you how to manage the risk, how to organize, whose role, what are they supposed to do, but they never tell you what risks to manage. That's because each of you is going to have a different perception of which risks you want to measure. But you're all starting from your own way of describing that, and we can't share anything. So we hope system of trust, if nothing else, will give a vocabulary, a concept that we can actually talk against. If it's wrong, tell us, we can change it. It's just bits. But the idea is, as a community, get something that we can use. Similar, the MITRE attack framework, is another thing that does that for how do people work inside your networks when you don't want them there. Well, this is what are the issues around supply chain. So it is a complement to those risk management approaches. It's the place where you can go learn what the risks may be and then pick the ones you want to focus on. It's also a way of bringing in data. It's describing what kind of information you need, where to get it, how to interpret it, and that we hope will evolve as people give us different inputs. Right now, it's very ICT-centric, but there's no reason why we can't move the item of supply and service into other areas. You know, counterfeits happen not just in chips and software, Gucci bags, sushi. So from a management point of view, the risks are similar, but when you get down to how do I measure it, it's what you're gonna look for is different. So we think this is actually a structure that any company can use no matter what industry they're in. And then the other part of this is we really think that this can knit together a lot of existing standards and show how to apply them into supply chain, as well as a lot of things you're already doing in software assurance and systems assurance that you can tie into this as the way of measuring some of these risks. So the way we're trying to do this, we're doing, you know, speaking, we're engaging, we're looking for feedback. The risk model management tool will be open sourced. It's heavily built on open source packages and capabilities, and then we glue it together in a way that it becomes a risk model manager. As I said, we have a website. There's a lot of material there you can find, catch up if you don't remember something. But also, if you go to that website and under the RMM menu, there's a place to get an account. And we have about 350 people around the world that have accounts that are exploring this. We should have an update. So the people gave us input last Christmas. Well, mostly they gave it after the holidays. But basically we rolled that into an update right before RSA this year. And we think we'll have another update in a couple weeks based on further input from a lot of people kicking the tires. Also, the tool should have an update in probably about a month to bring in that multi-level you know, source capability. So hopefully soon after, we'll have a place where you could get an account to add a standards mapping so that we can offer that as another way of interacting with us. And with that, I have 18 minutes for questions. Sorry to rush through all that, but I get so excited about it. Anybody have questions? She has a mic?
Yep, in the back. We do have some friends joining us online, so we will need a mic for Q&A, not just for the room.
Super selfish question. Where do we find those mappings to the various standards?
So right now, that's a work in progress. So that's we think, well, we know for at least 2 standards that we're doing, that it does offer great insight. And so that's why we want to do it for even more. But until we had the RMM updated to capture that, I didn't want to capture it, you know, in pages of paper or spreadsheets, because then I wouldn't be able to do anything with it. But by getting it captured in the tool, then we can leverage that to make it an active mapping. So sorry I gave the impression it was done. But it, you know, if you look at these standards, well, think about a DoD security facility clearance. It's going to ask you all kinds of things about the protections of the facility, how do people get access. Well, a lot of those speak to a lot of risks that you can have from, you know, people coming into your enclave and doing things you didn't want them to do. Another question?
Quick one. Do you see any differences between supply chain and third-party risks, or it's just one subset of others?
I think supply chain risks are, you know, coming to you from some other organization, but that other organization's security posture is part of what you are faced with from them. So evaluating your supplier's cybersecurity posture, their physical security posture, their financial stability, their susceptibility to tsunamis, all of those come together to, give you insight as to, are they going to be there when I need them? Are the products going to be good quality? They're not going to be an attack vector for me. So I think there's a lot of the same concepts are covered, and so the measurements done for one can be used in the other. But how you would use those measurements for a supply chain assessment versus a cybersecurity assessment will be a little subtle, a little different. I hope that answered your question.
This is just more of a question on the tool itself. I work across multiple different industries there. Are you able to create a profile that allows you to have different breakdowns into different subsets in the tool? Or is it, once you set your profile, you're kind of...
Well, the idea would be that you could set multiple profiles that together are what you do to do an assessment. So you may have an overall profile of when I do a mergers and acquisition, when I'm trying to buy a company, these are all the risks we're going to assess. But then you could have sub-profiles. This is what the financial team's going to look at. This is what the legal team's going to look at. This is what the physical security people are going to look at. So you could allocate it out by kind of a work area. We're still playing with all of that. We're still learning. But yeah, the idea here is start from the same content, mature that content globally, get it as good as we can get with as much detail about, okay, you get down to a final risk. What data do you need? It may be I need to go get it from some particular source. It may be I need to physically go there. I may need to take the product and do a certain test. Whatever the way you need to get data for that risk, and then how do I interpret it? Get that all documented, and then how do I slice it up for a particular business use? How do I get it narrow enough that it actually is practical to do it, and also it's repeatable so that when I look at the same or similar organizations for that kind of decision, I'm using the same measuring stick. Because if you don't, in the government, that's great grounds for protest. In business, it's probably grounds for lawsuits. You want to be, data-driven and repeatable is really our mantra. Other questions? Well, so sot.mitre.org. Please stop me. I'll be here the next 2 days. Glad to entertain questions, especially if you think of them later after some beers. Those are the good questions.
Thank you so much, Bob. We really appreciate it. While we have a little bit of extra time here, I have been getting a few questions about if the slides and the sessions will be available. They are all recorded and will be available on demand once you log on to the MWise portal with your credentials. So you can grab the slides from there. They won't be downloadable, but you can review the presentations and grab some screen grabs or whatever you need. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bob. We really appreciate it. Let's give Bob a round of applause.